Here I have one of those walking, noise-making toys. They're commonly adapted. The kids love them, the parents hate them. This one's from Five Below, and it has a leash attached to it. So just real quick, if you like what you see, hit the subscribe button and also check out my website at playenabled.com for more information on how to adapt this specific toy and another way to adapt this toy, as well as how to adapt some other toys. So this toy is a little bit different than most of the ones you'll find on Amazon because it has a leash. A lot of the ones that people adapt don't have a leash because they're simple to adapt. If it doesn't have a leash, you just put a battery interrupter in it. However, the leash does complicate it a little bit because it's not going to work with just a battery interrupter. You're going to have to adapt it, which is what I show in this video. However, I did realize after, but it was a little bit too late, that you might be able to still just put a battery interrupter in if you tape down the button in the leash. I wasn't able to test this theory though because I had already cut off the leash. So let's begin with what you're going to need. You will need your soldering iron with a way to clean it and extra solder, tin snips or a hand file, a mini screwdriver, a utility knife, your helping hands, the toy with two AA batteries, a switch for testing the toy, heat shrink tube, a lighter to shrink the heat shrink tube, and a battery interrupter. I made the battery interrupter from the leash that I cut off, and I'll show that in another video. The first step is always going to be test the toy. It's not as important with a battery interrupter, but it's good to get in the habit. So if I put a battery interrupter in right now with how the toy is, nothing's going to happen. It's not going to work. And the reason that is because it's a more complicated circuit. It's not a simple on-off button, but rather it has two switches. It has the on-off switch on the animal itself, as well as the one located in the leash. So the battery interrupter is not going to be able to interrupt the circuit because the circuit's already being opened by the second switch in the leash. So you're going to have to make an adaptation. I didn't realize until after that you could possibly tape down the switch in the leash and then use a battery interrupter. But I wasn't able to test this theory because I had already adapted the toy. So I'm going to start by cutting off the leash. I want to cut off most of it, leaving about an inch on the animal itself. So now I'm going to remove the rest of the leash that's on the animal. In order to do this, I'm going to take my utility knife and do a small and light cut down the middle of the black casing. The reason I do this is because I don't want to accidentally cut those two wires that you see. Then I'm going to take my nail and pull the wires apart. So once the wires are separated from the black casing, I'm going to cut off the black casing. And I want to cut it off as close to the animal as possible. And I'll explain why later. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect the two wires. So first I have to strip them. And I used 22 and it worked perfectly. So now the wires are stripped. I left the batteries in just to show you what happens if I connect them, but you're going to want to take them out. But as you can see, when I connect the two wires, so I'm twisting them together, what happens is the circuit is now complete because I got rid of the switch that was opening the circuit and connected the two wires to complete the circuit. So now if I put a battery interrupter in, the toy should work with the battery interrupter. Let's quickly test it out and see if that's the case. The toy does not turn on, which is good because the battery interrupter is there. So even though the toy's on, it's not doing anything. But now if I hit the switch, it works. So now I'm going to remove the batteries in order to start soldering. So I'm going to solder the two wires together. And as I'm doing it, I need to be careful that I don't accidentally drop solder on the animal and that I don't accidentally burn the fur of the animal, especially in this one where the ears of the bunny are pretty close to where I'm soldering. So I'm going to solder and I'm going to look for that shiny metallic color to let me know when I'm ready to go. Then once I see that, I'm going to stop soldering and let it cool for a minute. Then I'm going to cut it down just a little bit and add my heat shrink tube to cover those 2 wires. So I add my heat shrink tube, make sure it's completely covered, nothing sticking out. Then I'm going to shrink it down, again being careful not to burn the animal. Then I'm going to hide the wires inside the toy. I do this by going to the hole where the leash came out of the toy and sticking the wire back underneath it while I am pulling up the animal's fur. This kind of spreads out that hole so that you can get the wire back through. You can then sew this up, but I didn't find the need. It kind of hides itself. So now I'm going to test it just to show you real quickly and determine where to cut a notch for the battery interrupter to exit from. So it works. So now I'm going to create the notch by using my tin snips and a file. This was a long process because I kept cutting a little bit, checking, cutting a little bit, checking. The reason I did it here was because, as you can see, the toy has a screw to screw the battery cover into place, and I didn't want to mess with that, so I did it kind of off to this side. So I keep checking to make sure that the notch is big enough and that the wires aren't being hit by the plastic lid. Then I cut down the copper plate, and there we go. If you like what you saw, hit the subscribe button down below and check out my website at playenabled.com for more information on how to adapt this product, including a different way to adapt it, as well as other products.